What's happening, everybody? SmithyMan255 here again with you today. And today, if you read the title, we're going to talk about why I believe that progressivism and its various related ideologies is not a religion. And it's a fairly interesting concept, and I've seen a lot of people come out and say that these things like feminism and intersectionality and things like that, that people call them cults or kind of religions in a way, these kind of deeply held beliefs that are based on faith and things like that. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to go in and I wanted to see if I kind of bought this. I wanted to look into and see if I would agree that progressivism, the far left, the radical leftists, are a religion, and if they're religious in nature. So the first thing that I want to do is we're going to go in here and we're going to look at the definition of a religion. That sounds to me like the best place to start. So the first definition here says the state of a religious. So a religious, I assume, would be a person who is a religious person. So a nun in her 20th year of religion. The B definition is the service and worship of God or the supernatural. I don't think progressivism falls into this category. It's often very secular in nature. The second one here, commitment or devotion to religious faith or observance. Again, you're kind of using the word in the definition here. The second one is a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. Again, using the word, the definition. So we can kind of see how this concept is kind of complicated, and it's fairly nuanced. Here we have archaic, scrupulous conformity, conscientiousness. So, like, if someone says, he engages in that religiously, that would be, he brushes his teeth religiously every day. But number 4 here is one that particularly caught my eye. A cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. And this one, I think, does nail progressivism on the head quite a bit. It does not bring in a supernatural element to this political ideology. So I could see that under this definition that technically progressivism and associated ideologies could be considered non-theistic religions, and non-theistic religion basically being a religion that doesn't worship a god. And a lot of people refer to things like Buddhism, other Eastern religions that don't have gods, but people still treat them as religious ideologies because of kind of spirituality that goes hand in hand with them. So the next thing that I wanted to look at is certain specific, really big progressive ideologies. So, for example, intersectionality. Intersectionality predicated on basically oppressor versus oppressed. Who has power and who does not? And how do you take a person or a group of people and stack them against other individuals or groups and basically rank them in hierarchical order as to who is more privileged and who is more oppressed, right? And this is typically how intersectionality is used by progressive leftists in order to kind of rank people. So, for example, a heterosexual white male is going to have more systemic power than a homosexual white male. Therefore, the heterosexual white male has more institutional privilege and therefore has more power. And this can basically take you down a chain to see, based on all these different points of intersectionality, who is the most oppressed. So if you have the straight white male at the top, has most power in all of American society, you're going to have somebody like a bisexual, non-binary person of color at, somewhere further down as someone who experiences more oppression. And so you can already see, based on the complication of this, how it could very well roll into this kind of system of faith and belief. Because it's my opinion that there are some, for example, people of color, that intersectionality would argue these people might be oppressed. But they would not be more oppressed than I am, right? They would not be less privileged than I am as a straight white male. And like Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, he's a well-noted scientist. He probably makes a shit ton more money than I do. Like, he does TV spots, does interviews, all this sort of stuff, and I'm just an electrician making YouTube videos in my basement. So, it's hard to say whether or not I am more privileged than Neil deGrasse Tyson or, Barack Obama. People like this are well more privileged than I am. So, it's one of those things where intersectionality, you kind of have to take some of these things on faith, and it calls itself to a very collectivist ideology unless you're using it as a means by which to classify individuals. And I've gotten into that before. But the next progressive ideology, feminism, right? It predicated on a lot the same thing. The gender wage gap. You have to eschew more multivariate studies to basically argue that the gender wage gap exists due to sexism. That's not to say that a gender wage gap hasn't been found and doesn't exist, and we've found certain causes for it, like if you take aggregates, it's more so a mother gap, and it's more so women working fewer hours and things like that, and we found that it's more so predicated on choice. And now if you wanted to make the argument that in society, we might need to encourage women to get into fields that men might get into, or we might want to encourage these fields to allow more women into them. That's a whole other argument altogether. But you have to take it on faith that the wage gap, for example, is due to sexism. And so there's an element, a religious element, we can kind of squeeze in there, right? And, there's a lot of other talking points that you have to take on faith when it comes to the feminist ideology, or some of them, at least. And, and then there's other things that kind of get deeper, like critical theory. Again, critical theory largely based on group cohesions and who is oppressed and who is privileged and things like that, and how do you rank order them together. And ultimately, to me, seems a very Marxist way to look at things. But ultimately, what I ended up having to do is I compared these types of ideologies to the two major religions that I am most familiar with, and that would be Christianity and Islam. And they do share some commonalities, right? You have to take some things on faith, you have to read very deeply, and a lot of it is very much up to individual interpretation of certain texts. Now, things like feminism don't have a holy text, but they do have people who are very often cited. People like bell hooks are often cited by radical feminists as an icon, almost, as someone that you would definitely want to read. So you can look through that. You can look through various other feminist writers, and you can kind of see this build-up of an ideology. And furthermore, I would argue that rather than read these books by feminists, I would argue more so go in and read published papers by feminist scientists to see really what they believe to be important. And so one could argue that there are similarities there as far as, we have holy texts, we have, religious prophetic figures, things like that. But one thing that these political ideologies are lacking to be religions is, the supernatural element, the creation myth, the apocalypse myth that exists in almost all religions, and one other thing that I'll get to in a minute. But I honestly think that the greatest commonality that you can see between religion and these political ideologies, the far left political ideologies, is moral authoritarianism. And basically what this is people who believe that you must act this way, or society must act a certain way, in order to create a moral environment, right? So, for example, the Christians ruled the world in the United States from about the 80s when I was born, up until the 2000s. This is my life I'm talking about here. So the Christians kind of ruled the roost. And basically what happened was throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, you started to get a lot of pushback. You got your Marilyn Mansons, and you got your goth culture, and you got all this type of stuff that came out of, the punk rock scene in the 80s, and the 70s and the 80s. And what happened is that eventually the Christian moral authority failed as generations went on, right? Marriage equality is a good example of this. There was no good argument for not letting gay people get married, in my opinion. There were none. People could argue that, breakdown of the family unit or this or that or the other, but we've seen at this point that, there's not a whole lot of data now that gay marriage is legal federally, but there's been some data about how basically kids raised by gay parents turn out about the same as kids raised by two heterosexual parents. So it just is what it is. But one of the big reasons for not allowing gays to marry, and basically for the oppression, if you want to call, I think it would be apt to say oppression of gays up until very recently, was religious in nature. And so now we have marriage equality. And the religions, Christians, and we still have things like the Westboro Baptist Church and things like that we know despise the idea of gay marriage. Our vice president supported gay conversion therapy, right? We can pray the gay out of you. So it's one of those things where this is something that the religious held on to enforce moral standards on the greater society versus allowing for the freedom of choice of individuals. And I noticed that the progressive left does this as well. And they do it through censorship, and they do it through policing of speech, and they, you can't call a person this word. I know this word's been okay to say for a long time, but now you can't say it. If you say this, that, or the other, then you are a racist. The progressives tend to try to control linguistics, and they tend to try to control what you are and are not allowed to do. They claim that they're creating social consequences for your behavior that they disapprove of, that might be immoral. You might be a racist, you might be a sexist, you might be a homophobe, you might be a fascist, right? So all of these things intertwine, and then what they try to do is that they try to create some sort of what they refer to as a social consequence to correct this behavior. But they would claim it's correction, but to me it seems more like punishment. And again, we'll get more into that in a minute. The one major thing that I noticed that the progressive ideologies do not have, that every single other religion has, is a means by which you can achieve salvation. Now, 1,000 denominations of Christianity, but all of them have a means by which you can achieve salvation. Have you been baptized? The Catholics have confession. Other Christian sects have good works. You have to perform good works. Judaism is a lot based on good works, from what I understand. So it's one of those things where almost anyone, no matter what you've done, in most religions, have salvation myths. They have redemption. How can you come back into the fold and be redeemed after you have mistread, right? And even Islam has these rules as well. And so, even if you are not a Muslim, Islam has a means by which you can still stay in their society so long as you pay them. And it's one of those things where these ideologies do not seem to have any means by which you can achieve salvation if you have transgressed. So the first example I have is Kevin Hart. They dug up words that he had spoken several years ago, and they drug them up and they said he's a homophobe. Well, this was several years ago. It's almost as if they don't believe that he could change his mind, or that he might be able to come back and be like, hey, I was a lot younger. I don't think that way anymore. Stuff like that. It does not matter. They drug these up. You said this once. You are a homophobe. Now, the other one that I'm looking at, and I bring this up a lot, is the case of Louis C.K. And the reason I bring this up a lot is because I think he's a fascinating case study in the way the far left operates in these situations. So what did he do? Louis C.K. got in trouble because he got #MeToo'd for jerking off in front of women whom gave him consent. And the argument is that since Louis C.K. was a very popular comedian, and these women were up-and-coming comedians, that he was in a position of power over them, that he had the means by which he could make or break their careers, and therefore they felt coerced or kind of forced into consenting to Louis C.K. masturbating in front of them. And I've seen some people say it's no big deal, it's not like he touched them at all. I've heard other people equate it to forced penetration. So it all depends on who you're talking to, and that is one thing that particularly feminism has in spades. It is very denominational. There are lots of different versions of feminists out there. But what was his penance? What did they expect Louis C.K. to do after this information came to light during the high point of the Me Too era? Well, he came out, he admitted what he did wrong, he apologized for it, he said he was going to take some time off, and that's what he did. And he came back about 9 months later, was the first show back that he did after his scandal, and evidently that was not enough time. Now, one thing that I did during my research for this is I basically went on Google and I Googled, what did the feminists want Louis C.K. to do? And I read through several articles in the first and second pages of the Google search, and saw things from The Guardian, things like that, kind of left-wing outlets and op-eds. But most of them had a similar idea in mind, but none of them specified what exactly they wanted them to do, save for one, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the commonality that they all had was that 9 months was not enough time. 9 months was not enough time, and the lack of announcement, because he just kind of showed up at a comedy show and did some, open mic stand-up. People were very upset that he didn't warn people that he was coming out, because maybe some people in the audience might not have wanted to sit there through one of Louis C.K.'s sets. And to me, personally, if you know Louis C.K. is about to come on stage and you're upset with what he did, or you do not believe that he should be there, then that's up to you to leave. But I digress. Not enough time. Well, I found one Vanity Fair article linked in the description. I got a whole bunch of articles linked in the description about basically my rundown of this. But I had one Vanity Fair article that basically came out and wrote an imaginary set that this woman would have liked to see Louis C.K. perform his first night back, or on tour perhaps, that he would have a bit in his set that addressed what happened. And I'm not going to read through it, but I highly recommend you read through it and figure out what exactly this particular feminist wanted from Louis C.K. And the set is interesting because it starts off kind of Louis C.K. Starts off pretty funny in his vein, in his tone, but then by the end of it, it was just self-deprecating, self-flagellating, just beat myself up. I am the worst piece of shit, lowest piece of scum on the planet, and all men have to do better because of something that I did that was perceived to be wrong by a group of people who perceive a lot of things men do to be wrong. And it was very interesting to me because by the end of her imaginary set, it wasn't funny. I wasn't laughing. And it's just one of those things. Louis C.K. has always been kind of self-deprecating. It's part of his humor, right? But this was different from that. It wasn't in jest. It was just, I'm a shit person. And basically this woman proposed that he do this on a tour and say it over and over again every single night. And then she would have been satisfied. But other articles that cite this particular article basically said that would not have even been enough. And I've experienced some people claim that basically they would have been happy if he'd have just killed himself. And it's no good. It's no good to be like that. And so that's the thing. It's the moral authoritarianism that I think gets people when it comes to this is a religion. The moral authoritarianism and having to take things on faith. Just this kind of blind belief in things that people tell you because of an ideology. So, the lack of the salvation myth, in my opinion, is why I don't think you consider progressivism even a non-theistic religion. And you could consider it a very firmly held ideology, and you could probably force it into the definition that we looked at earlier, the fourth definition on that Webster. But ultimately, in my opinion, when you draw comparisons to other world religions, I don't think that it fits the bill. I think it's just a very authoritarian type of ideology. And I think one of the things that gets people the most about it is it's authoritarian in an underhanded way. And the things that they want you to do to be moral are linguistic, for the most part. There's not many behaviors that progressives really complain about, other than, serious ones like sexual assault, things like that. But there's not many behaviors that are specific to progressivism that wouldn't be despised by other people, right? Like the critical race theorists, for example, who argue for kind of oppression versus privilege for racial issues and things like that. Like the Black Lives Matter people, for example, they would be against lynching that might have taken place in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, but so were most people, right? These are horrific things that happen, and most people are against them. And it's just like the feminists with rape culture. Well, most people are against rape. The only people who aren't against rape are fucking rapists, and I would guess, right? But most people are against rape. So it's one of those things where you have to control it linguistically, and these are usually the sins that take place to progressives is linguistic sins. And this is where you find things like misgendering people as transphobic, and again, moral authoritarianism. You say a certain word, and all of a sudden you are a bigot, moral authoritarianism. This is how they are trying to control your behavior. And it's not much different from the Christians when you would come out and say, I'm an atheist. Well, you are an evil person. Moral authoritarianism, You can come out and say, Mom, Dad, I'm gay in the Bible Belt, and you get thrown out of your house. And it just is what it is. Now it seems like if you were living in a progressive household, you come out and say, Mom, Dad, I voted for Donald Trump, you get thrown out of your house. And it just, I think that is the commonality between them, is that notion of moral authoritarianism. But are they a religion? I don't think so. Because from what I've seen, there's no real way to redeem yourself in the eyes of these progressive ideologues. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think. Are progressives a religion of sorts? And if so, why? Other than that, have a fantastic week. I love you guys. Be good to each other.